You're just a foolish old woman, and soon, you won't even have a place at this table," Vanessa said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet clinking of silverware. And for a moment, no one moved. Not even Daniel, who sat beside her with his eyes fixed on his plate, as if the pattern on the china mattered more than the words his wife had just thrown at me. And I remember thinking how strange it was that after 71 years of living, after raising a son, after building a home peace with a man who used to reach for my hand across this very table, it wasn't the insult that hurt the most, it was the silence that followed it, the kind of silence that tells you exactly where you stand without anyone needing to say another word. So I didn't respond. I didn't raise my voice or defend myself. I simply set my fork down beside my plate, carefully, the way I had done thousands of times before during dinners that once meant something. And I looked at the table I had polished that morning. The same oak surface Daniel used to do his homework on when he was 10, the same table where his father had carved the Thanksgiving turkey every year. And for a brief second, I allowed myself to wonder when it had stopped being my home and started becoming just a place I occupied. And then I stood up, slow and steady, ignoring the way Vanessa leaned back in her chair with that faint, satisfied smile, the kind that doesn't come from joy but from certainty that she had already won something I hadn't realized we were competing for. And I walked out of the dining room without a word, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I understood something she didn't. That power doesn't always come from speaking. Sometimes it comes from choosing not to. And as I moved down the hallway, I could still hear the faint murmur of their voices behind me, low and dismissive, as if I were already gone, as if I had already been erased from the story of this house. And that was the moment I knew something had shifted, not just in them, but in me, because 2 days earlier, I had received a phone call that didn't make sense at the time. A polite voice asking me to confirm details about a property consultation I had never scheduled, mentioning my address like it belonged in a transaction I knew nothing about. And I had dismissed it then, assuming it was a mistake. But now, standing alone in the quiet of the hallway, I could feel the pieces beginning to move into place. Small details I had ignored suddenly felt heavier. The way the spare key I kept in the drawer had gone missing last week, the way Vanessa had started reorganizing rooms that weren't hers to touch, the way Daniel had stopped asking me simple questions like what I wanted for dinner or whether I needed anything from the store, as if my presence had become optional. And I walked into my bedroom, closing the door gently behind me, not slamming it, not making a scene, because scenes are for people who need to prove something, and I didn't need to prove anything. Not yet. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that still held traces of the life I had shared with my husband, his books neatly lined on the shelf, his reading glasses resting exactly where he had left them, and I let the quiet settle around me, not as a comfort, but as a kind of clarity, because in that silence, I could finally hear what had been there all along, the careful, calculated steps of someone slowly taking control. And I realized then that Vanessa's words at the table hadn't been an outburst. They had been a declaration, a glimpse of a plan already in motion. And Daniel's silence hadn't been confusion. It had been agreement, quiet, convenient agreement. And I felt something inside me shift again, not break, not shatter, but harden, like a door closing somewhere deep within. Because I had spent years believing that love was enough to hold a family together, that patience and kindness would be returned in kind. But sitting there in that room, I understood that sometimes love is simply taken, reshaped, and used against you. And for the first time since my husband passed, I didn't feel lost. I felt aware that whatever they thought they were doing, whatever plans they believed I would never notice, they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed I was no longer paying attention, and as I reached for the phone on my nightstand, my fingers steady despite everything, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not because I was happy, but because I finally understood the game they were playing, and more importantly, I knew something they didn't. I knew how it would end. I sat there for a long time after picking up the phone, staring at the contact I had not called in years, the name of our old family attorney, Martin Green, a man my husband trusted more than anyone when it came to matters that required both discretion and precision. And my thumb hovered over the screen as I replayed the voice from that strange phone call 2 days ago, the polite tone, the mention of a consultation I never scheduled. The way they spoke about my house as if it were already part of a transaction in progress. And slowly, the unease I had dismissed began to settle into something far more solid, something that felt less like confusion and more like quiet certainty. So I pressed call, and when Martin answered, his voice older but still steady, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I simply asked if there had been any recent inquiries about my property, any documents filed, any requests made in my name. And there was a pause on the other end, not a long one, but long enough to tell me that my question had landed somewhere important. And when he finally spoke, his tone had changed, careful, measured, the way people speak when they realize they are stepping into something delicate. He told me that there had been an inquiry, not directly from me, but from someone claiming to represent the household, someone asking about ownership structures, about transfer conditions, about how quickly a property like mine could be prepared for sale under certain circumstances. And I felt my fingers tighten around the phone, not in panic, but in recognition, because suddenly everything fit together in a way that was too precise to be coincidence. The missing key, the subtle changes in the house, the conversations that stopped when I entered a room, and most of all, the confidence in Vanessa's voice at the dinner table. That confidence had not come from nowhere. It had come from believing she already understood the outcome. And I asked Martin a simple question, one that mattered more than anything else at that moment. I asked him whose name was officially on the deed, and he did not hesitate when he answered, mine, fully and completely, exactly as my husband had arranged before he passed, with additional clauses that ensured no transfer could occur without my direct and informed consent. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to breathe a little deeper, not out of relief, but because I now understood the difference between what they thought they had and what actually existed, and that difference was where everything would unfold. Martin continued, explaining that whoever had made the inquiry did not appear to have full access to the documentation, that they were asking questions someone would only ask if they were trying to navigate around something they could not directly control. And I thanked him, my voice calm, steady, the same tone I had used my entire life when dealing with situations that required composure more than emotion. And before ending the call, I asked him to gather every document related to the house, every clause, every condition, and to be available should I need him in the coming days. He agreed without hesitation, and when the line went quiet, I set the phone down beside me and looked around the room again. But this time, it felt different, not like a space I was losing, but like a place I was beginning to understand again, because what Vanessa had underestimated was not my strength, it was my awareness. She had mistaken silence for weakness, patience for ignorance. And that is a mistake people rarely realize until it is too late. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the front yard, the same yard where Daniel used to play catch with his father, where laughter once carried through warm summer evenings. And I wondered, not for the first time, when exactly that boy had learned to look away instead of standing beside me. But I did not dwell on it, because answers to that question would not change what needed to happen next. And as I turned back toward the door, I could hear faint movement downstairs, the soft hum of voices, casual, unbothered, as if nothing significant had happened at the dinner table, as if I had already faded into the background of their lives. And I realized then that they believed they had time to arrange, to plan, to finalize whatever they thought was already in motion. But time, like everything else in this situation, was not what they believed it to be, because now I was paying attention. Now I was watching every detail, every word, every glance, and I understood something with absolute clarity. I would not confront them yet. I would not argue or accuse, because confrontation would only give them the chance to adjust, to hide, to shift their approach. And that was not what I wanted. What I wanted was to see the full shape of their intentions, to let them move forward exactly as they planned, believing I was still unaware, still the quiet figure at the edge of the table, because sometimes the only way to understand how far someone is willing to go is to let them keep going. And as I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, my expression calm, my movements unhurried, I knew that whatever came next, it would not be decided at a dinner table. It would be decided by something far more precise, something they had not prepared for. And as I made my way toward the stairs, I allowed myself that same small, quiet smile again, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that waits, because the game they believed they were winning had only just begun. I did not go back into the dining room that night. Instead, I moved through the house the way I always had, quietly, methodically, as if nothing had changed, as if I had not just heard my place in this family reduced to a sentence spoken between bites of dinner. And when I reached the kitchen later, the plates were already stacked near the sink, the chairs pushed in, the evidence of the evening erased with an efficiency that felt almost rehearsed. And Vanessa stood by the counter scrolling. Through her phone, her posture relaxed, her expression untouched by anything resembling concern, while Daniel dried his hands with a dish towel, avoiding my eyes even as I entered the room, and I noticed the way they both paused for a fraction of a second, not out of guilt, but out of calculation, as if they were assessing whether I had heard enough to matter, and I simply walked past them, opening the cabinet to retrieve a glass, filling it with water, taking a slow sip, giving them nothing, no reaction, no confrontation, no indication that anything had shifted inside me, because I understood now that what they expected was either anger or pleading, and I would give them neither. And after a moment, Vanessa spoke again, her tone lighter, almost casual, as if the earlier words had never been spoken, mentioning something about a real estate listing she had seen online, a house with modern finishes and an open floor plan, something that would be perfect for a growing family. And Daniel responded with a quiet agreement, adding that timing would be important if they were going to make any changes. And I stood there, listening, not to the words themselves, but to what sat underneath them, the assumption that decisions were already being made, the quiet confidence that I would not interfere, and I placed the glass back in the sink, turned, and left the room without a word, because every sentence they spoke confirmed what I already knew. And later that night, as the house settled into silence, I moved through each room slowly, not out of nostalgia, but out of observation, noticing the small adjustments that had gone unnoticed before, the drawer in the hallway that no longer held the spare key, the study where certain documents had been shifted just slightly out of alignment, the guest room where boxes had been stacked in a way that suggested preparation rather than storage, and with each detail, the outline of their plan became clearer, not fully formed yet, but enough to understand its direction, enough to know that they believed they were working ahead of me. And when I finally returned to my bedroom, I sat at the desk by the window and opened the drawer where I kept the few remaining papers my husband had organized. Before he passed, documents I had not needed to revisit until now. And as I spread them out in front of me, I remembered the conversations we had shared, the quiet evenings when he insisted on going over everything with a level of care that had seemed unnecessary at the time, his voice calm, patient, explaining each clause, each safeguard, each detail designed to protect not just the house, but me. And I had listened then with half my attention, trusting that his presence alone was enough to keep everything steady. But now, reading through those same pages, I understood the foresight behind every word, the deliberate way he had ensured that ownership could not be assumed, could not be transferred without clarity and consent, and I felt something steady settle within me, not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of focus that replaced both, because this was no longer about what had been said at the table. It was about what was being attempted in silence, and I gathered the documents, carefully, placing them back into the folder, knowing I would need them soon. But not yet, not until I had seen enough to act without hesitation. And as I turned off the lamp and lay down in bed, the darkness of the room felt different from the nights before, less like emptiness and more like space, space to think, to plan, to wait, and I listened to the faint sounds of the house settling, the distant footsteps above me, the quiet closing of a door, the low hum of voices that eventually faded into nothing, and I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to organize the thoughts that had begun to align with a precision I had not felt in years, because they believed they were moving quietly, carefully, unnoticed. But what they did not understand was that every quiet move leaves a trace, every careful step creates a pattern, and patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. And as I lay there, still and composed, I knew that whatever came next would not be rushed. It would not be driven by emotion or reaction. It would unfold exactly when it needed to, and when it did, it would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It would simply be undeniable. I woke before sunrise the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because something in me had shifted into a kind of quiet alertness that no longer allowed rest to come easily. And as I lay there for a moment, staring at the faint light filtering through the curtains, I realized that this house, the one I had lived in for more than 3 decades, no longer felt like a place of comfort. It felt like a place of observation, a space where every movement carried meaning and every silence concealed intention. And I sat up slowly, reaching for the robe draped over the chair, moving through my usual routine with the same calm precision I had always relied on. Because routine, I had learned, is one of the easiest ways to remain invisible when others believe they already understand you. And when I stepped into the hallway, the house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that exists just before everything begins, and I made my way to the kitchen, setting the coffee maker the way I had every morning for years, measuring each scoop carefully, listening to the familiar sound of water heating, grounding myself in something steady while everything else around me shifted. And as the first scent of coffee filled the air, I noticed something new, something small but unmistakable, a folder placed neatly on the corner of the counter where nothing had been the night before, and I did not rush toward it. I did not reach for it immediately. Instead, I poured my coffee, took a slow sip, and only then did I walk over and open it, because haste reveals more than patience ever does. And inside were printed listings, multiple properties, each marked with notes in Vanessa's handwriting, prices circled, timelines underlined, small comments about potential renovations and resale value. And tucked between those pages was a document draft, incomplete, but clear enough to understand its purpose, outlining a proposed transition of residence. Language that suggested temporary relocation for me under the pretense of convenience, something about downsizing, about making things easier. And I let my eyes move across each line without reacting, without allowing even the smallest change in my expression, because what I was seeing was not a surprise anymore. It was confirmation that what had been implied was now being prepared, shaped into something they believed could be presented as reasonable, even beneficial. And I closed the folder gently, placing it exactly where I had found it, because removing it would change the rhythm of their plan, and I had no intention of doing that. Not yet. And a few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs, followed by Vanessa's voice, light, casual, greeting the morning as if it carried no weight at all. And when she entered the kitchen, her eyes moved briefly to the folder and then to me. And in that brief glance, I saw it again. That same quiet certainty, that same belief that everything was unfolding exactly as she intended. And she smiled, a polite, almost rehearsed expression, asking if I had slept well, and I returned the same level of calm, the same measured tone, telling her that I had. Even though we both understood that the truth did not matter in this exchange, what mattered was maintaining the surface, the illusion of normalcy that allowed everything beneath it to continue undisturbed. And Daniel joined us shortly after, his presence more hesitant, his movements slower, as if he were aware on some level that something had shifted but unwilling to name it. And the three of us stood there for a moment, sharing a space that no longer held the meaning it once did. And Vanessa began speaking again, this time about future plans, about possibilities, about how certain changes could benefit everyone involved. Her words carefully chosen, wrapped in the language of practicality and care, and I listened, not interrupting, not questioning, simply allowing her to lay out pieces of a narrative she believed I would accept without resistance. And when she finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that invites response, and I gave her one, a simple nod, a quiet acknowledgement that revealed nothing. And I watched the subtle shift in her posture, the slight relaxation that came from believing she had been understood. And as I turned to rinse my cup in the sink, I realized that this was exactly where I needed them to be, comfortable, confident, certain that their version of events was progressing without interference, because certainty creates patterns, and patterns create opportunities. And as I dried my hands and stepped away from the counter, I carried that awareness with me, not as a burden, but as a tool, something I would use when the time came. And as I moved back toward the hallway, leaving them behind in the kitchen, their voices blending into a quiet conversation about timelines and next steps, I knew that what they believed to be the beginning of an ending was, in fact, something else entirely, something they had not yet imagined. And I allowed myself that same small, controlled smile once more, because the more certain they became, the clearer the path ahead would be for me. That afternoon, I left the house for the first time in days, not because I needed anything from outside, but because I understood that staying too still, too present, could disrupt the quiet rhythm they had begun to rely on. And as I drove down the familiar streets of the neighborhood, passing the same houses I had watched rise over the years, I found myself remembering a different time, when every decision made within my own home had been discussed, shared, built on mutual respect rather than quiet assumption, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel just slightly, not out of anger, but out of focus, because those memories were no longer something to return to, they were something to learn from. And when I arrived at Martin Green's office, I sat in the parking lot for a moment before stepping out, allowing myself one last breath of stillness before the next phase began. And inside, the office looked exactly as it always had. Polished wood, soft lighting, the faint scent of old paper and careful order. And Martin greeted me with the same steady presence I remembered, though this time there was a seriousness in his expression that told me he understood this was not a routine visit. And once we were seated, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I simply told him everything I had observed: the missing key, the property inquiry, the documents left on the counter. The conversation spoken just loudly enough to be heard, but never addressed directly. And as I spoke, he listened without interruption, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his gaze steady, absorbing each detail with the kind of attention that only comes from experience. And when I finished, he leaned back slightly, taking a moment before responding. And then he explained something that clarified everything even further. He told me that while my name remained solely on the deed, there were legal strategies people sometimes attempted, ways to create pressure, to present situations as if they were already decided, to push someone into agreement under the weight of confusion or emotional strain. And I nodded slowly, because that was exactly what I had begun to see, not a direct attempt to take something, but a carefully constructed path designed to make me step aside willingly. And Martin continued, outlining the protections already in place, clauses that required explicit consent, conditions that could not be bypassed without clear violation. And he assured me that nothing could be transferred, sold, or altered without my full awareness and approval. And as he spoke, I felt that same steady clarity return, not as relief, but as confirmation that the ground beneath me was still solid, regardless of what they believed. And I asked him then what would happen if someone attempted to move forward without that consent, and his answer was simple: it would not hold. Any such action would collapse under scrutiny, and those responsible would be exposed for overstepping their legal bounds. And I let that settle for a moment before asking him for one more thing. I asked him to prepare everything, every document, every clause, every detail that could be needed, not to act yet, but to be ready, because timing, I had learned, was everything. And he agreed without hesitation, understanding that this was not about immediate reaction, but about precise response. And when I left his office, the air outside felt different. Clearer somehow, not because anything had changed, but because I now understood exactly where everything stood. And as I drove home, I thought about the way Vanessa had spoken that morning, the confidence in her voice, the ease with which she had outlined plans that did not include me. And I realized that confidence was built on assumption, the assumption that I would not question, would not verify, would not act. And as I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment, looking at the house, the same house that had held decades of my life. And I saw it differently now, not as something fragile or at risk, but as something protected, something anchored by decisions made long before any of this began. And when I stepped inside, the house was quiet again. Vanessa's voice faintly audible from another room, speaking on the phone in that same controlled tone, discussing timelines, possibilities, next steps. And I moved through the space calmly, setting my keys down, removing my coat, becoming once again the quiet presence they had grown used to overlooking. And as I passed the doorway, I caught a fragment of her conversation, something about finalizing details soon, about making everything official. And I did not stop. I did not react. I simply continued walking, because what she did not understand was that nothing was official until I allowed it to be. And as I reached the staircase and placed my hand on the railing, I felt that same steady resolve settle within me. Not loud, not dramatic, but firm, because I knew now that whatever they believed was already decided was, in fact, still entirely within my control. And the moment would come when that truth would no longer be quiet. The next morning, I moved through the house even more carefully than before, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I understood that every ordinary movement I made helped reinforce the version of me they had already accepted, the quiet, aging woman who followed routines and asked no questions. And as I set the table for breakfast, placing each plate with the same steady hands, I could hear Vanessa in the living room speaking on the phone again, her voice low but confident, the kind of confidence that comes from believing there is no opposition. And I did not need to hear every word to understand the direction of the conversation, because tone alone can reveal more than content ever does. And when Daniel joined her, his voice softer, more hesitant, I paused just long enough to listen, catching fragments about timing, about how it would be easier once certain paperwork was ready, about how I would not resist if everything was presented the right way. And I resumed my movements without reacting, because what they did not realize was that every assumption they made about me was quietly working in my favor. And when they finally came into the kitchen, I greeted them with the same calm expression, the same gentle tone I had always used, asking if they wanted coffee, offering breakfast, maintaining a rhythm that gave them no reason to adjust theirs. And Vanessa smiled, that same composed smile, thanking me as if nothing unusual existed between us. And she began speaking again, this time more directly, mentioning that she and Daniel had been thinking about the future, about what would be best for everyone, about how large houses can become difficult to manage, especially for someone my age. And I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, my posture relaxed, because interruption would have shifted the balance, and balance was something I intended to control. And when she finished, waiting for a response, I gave her one, a simple acknowledgement, a quiet agreement that I understood what she was saying, and I watched the relief flicker across her face, subtle but unmistakable, because agreement, even implied, was exactly what she had been working toward. And Daniel nodded as well, his shoulders easing as if a weight had been lifted. And in that moment, I saw clearly how deeply they believed their plan was already succeeding, how easily they accepted the version of events they had constructed. And as we sat down to eat, the conversation shifted to ordinary topics, the weather, errands, small details that filled the space where something far more significant was unfolding beneath the surface. And I responded when necessary, contributing just enough to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but not enough to alter the direction they had chosen. And after breakfast, Vanessa suggested that we could all sit down later in the week to discuss options, to go over details together, and I agreed again, calmly, because that was exactly what I wanted, for everything to be brought into the open on their terms, where they felt most confident. And as the day continued, I observed more than I spoke, noticing how often Vanessa checked her phone, how frequently Daniel deferred to her in small decisions, how the structure of the household had already shifted in ways that suggested control rather than cooperation. And by the afternoon, I had seen enough to confirm that their next step would not be subtle. It would be presented as a solution, something reasonable, something that appeared considerate on the surface while quietly removing me from the center of the home I had built. And when evening came, I returned to my room once more, closing the door behind me with the same gentle motion, sitting at the desk as I had the night before. And I opened the folder Martin had prepared for me earlier that day, reviewing each document carefully, not because I needed to memorize them, but because I wanted to feel the weight of what they represented, the structure, the protection, the truth that existed beyond assumption and intention. And as I placed the papers back into the folder, I realized that everything was now aligned, their plan, my awareness, the legal reality that stood between them. And I leaned back in the chair, allowing myself a moment of stillness, not to rest, but to recognize that the moment I had been waiting for was approaching, not because I would create it, but because they would, driven by their own certainty. And as I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed they were preparing to move me out of this house. But in truth, they were preparing something else entirely, something they would not recognize until it was already too late. And I turned away from the window with that same controlled calm, knowing that when the time came, I would not need to raise my voice, I would not need to argue, because the truth, when presented correctly, does not require force, it simply stands, and everything built on assumption falls away on its own. The following evening, Vanessa approached me with a kind of careful enthusiasm that felt almost rehearsed. Her tone softened just enough to sound considerate, as if the words she was about to say had been practiced more than once before reaching me. And she suggested that we all sit down after dinner to talk through some ideas, to make sure everyone was on the same page. And I agreed without hesitation, my voice calm, my expression unchanged, because this was the moment they had been building toward. The moment where assumption would turn into proposal, and proposal into expectation. And as the hours passed, I moved through the day exactly as I had before, preparing dinner, setting the table, maintaining the same steady rhythm that allowed them to remain comfortable, because comfort was what kept them predictable, and predictability was what allowed me to see everything clearly. And when we finally sat down together, the air felt different, not tense, but purposeful, as if something important was about to be finalized. And Vanessa began speaking first, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture upright, her voice measured, explaining how she and Daniel had been thinking about the future, about what would make the most sense for everyone involved, about how the house, while beautiful, might no longer be the most practical place for me to stay, especially given its size and maintenance. And she spoke about alternatives, about communities designed for comfort and convenience, places where I could have support, where I would not have to manage everything alone. And I listened, not interrupting, not questioning, allowing her to complete the narrative she had constructed, because interruption would have broken the flow, and I needed to see exactly how far she intended to take it. And when she finished, Daniel added a few words of his own, quieter, less certain, but still aligned, emphasizing that this was about care, about making sure I was comfortable, about doing what was best in the long term. And I nodded slowly, acknowledging each point as if I were considering it seriously, because in a way, I was not the proposal itself, but the structure behind it, the way it had been presented, the assumptions it relied on, the confidence that I would accept it without resistance. And there was a brief pause, the kind that waits for agreement, for confirmation, for the final step that turns suggestion into decision. And I gave them what they expected, a soft, measured response, telling them that I understood their concerns, that I appreciated them thinking about the future, that I would need a little time to consider everything carefully. And I watched the way Vanessa's shoulders relaxed, the way Daniel let out a breath he had been holding, because to them, this was progress. This was the moment where everything began to move forward. And Vanessa suggested that they had already started looking into options, that there were places available, timelines that could work, that it would be best to begin preparing soon. And I agreed again, calmly, reinforcing the belief that I was moving in the direction they had planned. And the conversation shifted after that, the intensity dissolving into lighter topics, as if something had been accomplished, as if a decision had already been made. And when dinner ended, I cleared the table as I always did, moving through each task with quiet efficiency, aware of their glances, their subtle exchanges, the shared understanding between them that their plan was now in motion. And later, as I stood at the sink rinsing the last plate, Vanessa approached me once more, her voice gentle, almost warm, thanking me for being open, for understanding. And I turned slightly, meeting her eyes for just a moment, offering a small, polite smile, the kind that reveals nothing, because gratitude, in this case, was not about appreciation, it was about confirmation that I was exactly who they believed me to be. And as she walked away, satisfied, I dried my hands slowly, placing the towel back in its place, and I felt that same steady clarity settle over me again, not as a reaction, but as a decision, because everything had now been said, everything had been placed on the table in the way they had intended, and that meant the next step would not come from them. It would come from me, not as a confrontation, not as an argument, but as something far more precise, something that did not rely on emotion or persuasion. And as I turned off the kitchen light and made my way toward the stairs, I understood with complete certainty that they believed they had just secured my agreement. But in reality, they had done something else entirely. They had revealed exactly how they intended to proceed. And in doing so, they had given me everything I needed to ensure that, when the truth was finally presented, it would not be questioned, It would not be debated. It would simply stand, clear and undeniable, exactly as it was meant to be. 2 days later, Vanessa told me that everything was ready, her voice carrying that same controlled brightness as she mentioned that a few documents had been prepared, nothing complicated, just formalities to help move things along smoothly, and she suggested that we sit down together that afternoon to review them, and I nodded, setting my cup of coffee down with the same steady motion I had practiced for days now, because this was the moment they had been working toward, the moment where assumption would attempt to become reality. And as the afternoon light settled across the living room, we gathered at the table, the same table where so many conversations had once carried warmth, now arranged neatly with papers aligned in careful stacks. And Vanessa took her seat first, her posture composed, her confidence unmistakable, while Daniel sat beside her, quieter, his hands resting uneasily on the table. And I took my place across from them, calm, attentive, allowing the scene to unfold exactly as they had planned. And Vanessa began speaking, her tone professional, almost rehearsed, explaining that these documents would help simplify things, that they outlined a transition plan, a temporary relocation that would make everything easier for me while they handled the responsibilities of the house. And she slid the papers toward me, her fingers lingering just a moment as if emphasizing their importance. And I looked down at them without immediately reaching out, letting the silence stretch just enough to shift the atmosphere slightly, because silence, when placed carefully, can carry more weight than words. And when I finally picked up the top page, I read it slowly, line by line, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted them to believe that I did, that I was processing, considering, moving through this exactly as they had expected. And Vanessa continued speaking as I read, filling the space with explanations, with assurances, with carefully chosen phrases about convenience and care. While Daniel remained mostly silent, his gaze moving between us as if searching for something he could not quite name. And when I finished reviewing the first page, I set it down gently and looked up at them, my expression unchanged, my voice steady as I asked a simple question, whether they believed this arrangement would be finalized without any complications. And Vanessa answered immediately, her confidence unshaken, assuring me that everything had been handled, that it was a straightforward process, that all that was needed was my agreement. And I nodded slowly, acknowledging her response. And then I reached into the folder I had brought with me, placing it on the table with the same careful precision. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, brief but unmistakable, because this was not part of the plan she had constructed. And I opened the folder, sliding a set of documents toward them, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a quiet certainty that did not require emphasis. And I watched as Vanessa's expression shifted, her eyes scanning the first page, her posture stiffening almost imperceptibly, while Daniel leaned forward, his confusion growing as he tried to follow what was unfolding. And I did not rush to explain, I did not interrupt their reading. I simply allowed the information to settle, because truth, when presented clearly, does not need to be defended. It only needs to be seen. And after a moment, Vanessa looked up, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, asking what exactly these documents were. And I answered calmly, explaining that they outlined the legal structure of the property, the ownership, the conditions under which any changes could be made, and the protections that had been put in place long before any of this began. And Daniel spoke then, his voice uncertain, asking what that meant for the plans they had discussed. And I met his gaze briefly, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity. And I told him that it meant nothing could move forward without my full and informed consent, that no arrangement, no transition, no agreement could be made without acknowledging the reality that had been established years ago. And the room fell quiet after that, not with tension, but with realization, because what had been assumed was now being replaced by what was true. And Vanessa's hands rested on the table, still but no longer relaxed, her mind clearly adjusting to information she had not anticipated. And I closed the folder slowly, placing it back in front of me. And I did not add anything more, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The moment had already shifted, the direction had already changed. And as I sat there, composed and steady, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something they had not prepared for, something that could not be shaped by assumption or guided by quiet pressure, and for the first time since this began, the silence in the room belonged to me. No one spoke for a long moment after the documents settled on the table, and in that silence, I could see the shift happening, not all at once, but in small, unmistakable ways, the kind of change that does not announce itself but reveals everything. And Vanessa was the first to recover, her fingers moving lightly over the edge of the paper as if trying to regain control of something that had already slipped beyond her reach. Her voice steady but no longer effortless as she said there must be some misunderstanding, that perhaps the documents were outdated, that things could be adjusted, and I listened without interrupting, because interruption would have given her something to push against, and I had no intention of giving her that. And Daniel looked between us, his confusion now fully visible, his posture no longer relaxed, his hands clasped together as if trying to hold on to something that no longer made sense. And he asked quietly what all of this meant, not in the confident tone of someone who already knew the answer, but in the uncertain voice of someone realizing he never had. And I turned my attention to him then, meeting his eyes briefly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that did not need to be explained. And I told him that it meant exactly what it said, that the house was mine, that it had always been mine in every way that mattered, and that no plan, no discussion, no arrangement could change that without my direct decision. And the weight of those words did not come from how they were spoken, but from the fact that they did not need to be repeated. And Vanessa tried again, her tone shifting slightly, softer now, more careful, suggesting that everything they had discussed had been for my benefit, that they were only trying to help, that perhaps I had misunderstood their intentions, and I let her finish, allowing every word to settle into the space between us. Because intention, when revealed under pressure, often changes shape, and when she stopped, waiting for a response, I gave her one, simple and measured, telling her that I understood her intentions perfectly, and that was why I had taken the time to understand the facts just as clearly. And there was another pause then, heavier this time, because the space for assumption had closed, and in its place was something neither of them could easily navigate. And Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. His expression caught somewhere between realization and regret, and I watched him for a moment, not as a son, but as a man who had made a choice, a quiet choice to follow rather than question, to accept rather than verify. And I did not say anything about that, because some understandings do not need to be spoken to be felt, and Vanessa's composure held, but just barely, the edges of her confidence now visible where they had once been hidden, and she asked what I intended to do next, her voice careful again, measured in a way that suggested she was trying to find solid ground, and I considered the question for a moment, not because I needed time to answer, but because I understood the importance of how the answer would be given, and I told her that nothing needed to be done immediately, that the house would remain exactly as it was, that no changes would be made without clear agreement, and that any future decisions would be made based on reality, not assumption. And I stood then, not abruptly, not with any sense of finality, but with the same calm motion I had used every day of my life, and I gathered my folder, closing it carefully, because this was not a moment that required drama, it required clarity, and as I stepped away from the table, I paused just long enough to look at both of them, and I said one final thing, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple truth, that I had spent my entire life building this home, and I would not allow it to be taken apart by decisions that were never mine to begin with. And I turned then, leaving the room in the same quiet way I had before, but this time the silence behind me was different. It no longer carried dismissal or certainty. It carried something else, something uncertain, something unsettled. And as I walked down the hallway, past the rooms that still held the echoes of a life I had built, I felt no need to look back, because everything that needed to be seen had already been revealed. And when I reached my bedroom, I closed the door gently, the soft click marking the end of something that had never truly belonged to them, and the beginning of something that was entirely mine to decide.